The Minnesota House of Representatives Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform will come to order. The clerk will take the roll.
Chair Mariani.
Present.
Mariani, present. Vice Chair Frazier.
Present.
Frazier, present. Representative Johnson.
Present.
Johnson, present. Representative Edelson.
Present.
Edelson, present. Representative Feist.
Present.
Feist, present. Representative Grossel.
Here.
Grossel, present. Representative Hollins.
Present.
Hollins, present. Representative Hewitt.
Hewitt, present.
Hewitt, present. Representative Cleavorn.
Cleavorn, present.
Cleavorn, present. Representative Long. Representative Long. Representative Lucero. Representative Lucero. Representative Mueller.
Present.
Mueller, present. Representative Novotny.
Present.
Novotny, present. Representative O'Neill.
Present.
O'Neill, present. Representative Pinto.
Present.
Pinto, present. Representative Poston.
Present.
Poston, present. Representative Raleigh.
Raleigh, present.
Raleigh, present. Representative Vang.
Present.
Vang, present. Representative Zhang.
Present.
Zhang, present. Representative Long. Representative Lucero.
Present.
Lucero, present. That concludes the roll.
Very well, members. We do have a quorum. Thank you all for being here and being here on time. Happy Friday to everyone. And thank you to Laura Sparkman for pinch hitting on behalf of Caitlin. Ogumfamali, our regular committee legislative assistant, she took ill a couple days ago, and so let's all send her some good healing thoughts so that she could be well soon and be with us as well. Members, this hearing is being conducted remotely on an electronic platform pursuant to Minnesota House Rule 10.01, Emergency House Operations in response to the COVID-19 infectious disease pandemic requiring public health exercise of social distancing. Members, today we will continue our look at public safety issues in greater Minnesota. As you'll recall, yesterday we heard from a rural sheriff, Renville County, and a county attorney from just outside the Twin Cities urban core, I believe in Representative Johnson's, part of Representative Johnson's district up in the Chisago County area. We learned of distinct issues and realities they face and manage. We also heard from our state public safety department on how the state works to align those realities and create synergy with locals for keeping the public safe. And because criminal activity can also jump across both county and state lines, we heard that tending to the local is how we protect all of us. We heard just that on Tuesday when we heard the report of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Task Force. And we heard it from American Indian Minnesotans who work with law enforcement, researchers, and community activists in preparing that report, and they'll be issuing legislative proposals to us shortly. Last week, we heard a Twin Cities perspective from the Minneapolis chapter of the longest standing civil rights organization in our nation, and from a statewide justice reform organization that commands the respect of prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys. Both testifiers were African-American Minnesotans. Both encouraged us to keep up the work of police accountability. Today, as I said, we will add to our listening, hearing about greater Minnesota realities by hearing from local communities of color and about crime prevention intervention efforts in greater Minnesota. And so that's how the chair has structured today's conversation in those two distinctive parts. We will begin by hearing from a couple testifiers on the effects of public safety realities on communities of color in greater Minnesota. And then we'll move to the prevention, intervention, programming needs in greater Minnesota, where we will hear from three testifiers. Members, it's 5 testifiers, so I certainly do want to make sure that we give them the time, the respect of the time that they need to share their observations with us. And hopefully, as yesterday, we'll have a good, healthy discussion and conversation that hopefully will include everyone if the clock doesn't run out on us. So members, with that, I'm going to begin by the conversation on overview of issues affecting communities of color in greater Minnesota. And first up from, oh shoot, I don't have where this person is from. I believe from Moorhead, but I'm not certain. Jamel Abegas, Black Lives Matter activist. I think you're from the Moorhead area, but I might be wrong about that. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and share your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jamal Abigaz, and up until very recently, I've been an activist and organizer with Black Lives Matter Fargo-Moorhead. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak here before you today, and I want to start with a quote. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. That was by President Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell address. I start there because how we spend the limited resources the state of Minnesota has is crucially important to actually meeting the material needs of Minnesotans. And as state legislatures, you serve at the behest of the people to set the policies which will make our state better. Policing currently represents a late stage answer to problems that our fellow Minnesotans face. And as a matter of public policy, we the people currently pay a premium for a pound of cure when we could be paying far less for the proverbial ounce of prevention. Now, as I have engaged in activism, I have been met with any number of assertions that, oh, the police are fine, our police are fine, the issues of policing which face larger cities don't occur in greater Minnesota. And we know that that's not the case. And we know that while legislators such as yourself exist, serve all of the people, you serve your constituencies, and many of you are reticent to consider the policies that would refund other portions of the state budget that would keep people from requiring police intervention. And in this manner, I've been told everything, including essentially going back to Africa, that I should go back to Africa by a state legislator in North Dakota. Now, I just want to make it quite clear. The dollars that you spend on policing, do they meet the needs of Minnesotans? They certainly don't address their housing needs. In April of 2020, activists in the community and myself came together to help one of my neighbors on my street who was dealing with a slumlord who was throwing her out on the street. There was mold in the unit. The rental license that was obtained was out of date. They had switched property managers twice. The police aren't dealing with this issue, right? They aren't dealing with the other unit that was in that same building, with a person who was on a housing voucher, a mother of 5 who didn't have a working toilet and was told that her toilet wasn't going to be fixed until after COVID. That person who was too afraid to actually file a complaint. The dollars that you spend on policing could largely go elsewhere. Again, an ounce of cure is worth far more than the pound of prevention in this instance. So what I'm encouraging you all to consider as you go in to fund the budget, that you understand fully that money spent on guns, ammunition, cars, tanks, whatever you're spending this money on that's going to policing could do far more to improve the lives of Minnesotans in funding instead education, job training, housing, and the like. And with that, I'm gonna close, and I'll be here for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Mr. Abigas. There will no doubt be questions. What I'm going to do is move through our testifiers, and then depending on the time, I may just pause and do questions like I did yesterday in the middle, or depending on our time, we'll run through all the testifiers and then collect questions at the end. So hopefully you'll be able to join us or stay with us during that period of time. Thank you for joining us today. Next, we have Winona LeDuc, a Line 3 activist, and Ms. LeDuc's vita is rather long and important, and so I won't do that. I'm hoping that she'll be able to add in terms of knowledge of her to the committee in her comments. So with that, welcome to our committee, Ms. LeDuc.
Ani Nindaway Maganajuk, can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. I'm here on the banks of the Mississippi River with a couple of other women. I'm Anishinaabe. I'm Bear Clan. I'm from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. I ran twice for the office of Vice President of the United States. And for the past 7 years, I've testified and participated in every public process opposing the Enbridge Line 3 because it's a really ridiculously bad idea for the state of Minnesota and for the Anishinaabe. And so now what I find is that, you know, the North has always been a little tense. Some of the representatives from the North may not see it as such, but if Indian arrest rates are 7 times that of non-Indians, our incarceration rates and our death in custody is higher than anybody else, we've had some concerns as Native people historically. Now, those concerns have been augmented. What I feel like is that it's very clear that we live in the deep North right now. And those concerns have largely been augmented by the Enbridge Corporation and the Minnesota PUC's approval of the permits on Enbridge's Line 3. The reason that this is a deep concern to us is because, of course, Enbridge has said that they will pay for the police costs in Minnesota associated with ensuring that they are able to put in Line 3. And attendant to that, there's a lot of, I believe, civil rights problems that are associated with a Canadian multinational paying the expenses of your police force in the state of Minnesota to ensure that a project that they want to get through is enabled to happen. Now, how that's unrolled so far has been very problematic to us. So we've seen, first of all, the rise in security forces in the North, particularly a lot of unmarked and private security forces. And we're really not sure who's in charge of those forces and who holds them accountable and what equipment they have and what they do. As far as we know, there's nothing. We have seen Enbridge unloading equipment at Hubbard County Sheriff's Office. I'm not sure what they did when they unloaded there. I would like to know as a member of the public what police offerings Enbridge is giving in the North. We think that that's a matter of public interest. I know that in correspondence with Minaga, which some of you know as a town of about 1,300, they were talking about tasers and stun guns and other non-lethal equipment to be used potentially on water protectors around Line 3 and hoping that Enbridge would provide more of that. So I don't know what equipment is up here, but I know that it's only 2 months in and we've had 50 people arrested. And most of those are actually non-Indian people from the Twin Cities or from the North. Not all Indian people that are getting arrested. They're good Minnesota citizens that actually just are water protectors. And they want to protect Minnesota and the waters here from climate criminals and water criminals like Enbridge, who have a proven track record of destroying water, and also a proven track record after Standing Rock in North Dakota of helping to finance a severe repression instead of civil rights violations, which in fact occurred in Standing Rock and that Minnesota is well aware of. More recently, however, we have seen a rise in a lot of really disturbing civil rights violations and a lack of adequate police and authorities' response to Enbridge's violations. So we give you a good example. There is a road called a Great River Road, which of course is on the Mississippi River in northern Minnesota. Now that road, when you get north of Palisade, all of a sudden has all kind of signs on it to say you can't park here and you got to slow down and you got 20 miles an hour. Well, the no parking signs were allegedly set up by Aiken County for public safety. And so you've got a mile of no parking signs on either side of the residence in the house of King. As a result, people have to walk on the road by trucks. And those trucks are not going 20 miles an hour. Those trucks, we have clocked them, are speeding. There has never been an Enbridge vehicle that has been cited for a traffic violation in Aiken County. And yet what we find is that many of our water protectors are pulled aside for pretty much nothing except for, oh, I was pulled aside once because there was snow on my license plate. And then we have the problem of the surveillance that is occurring to water protectors in the north, detailing of individuals, and the intimidation which has been occurring largely by police forces in the north who are financed by Enbridge. This has been a deep concern to us. And, I'll give you an example. So we're over there on Highway 169, and I went over there, I was dancing and praying, that this pipe wouldn't come in. And all of a sudden you look, and there must have been 50 police officers across the road from us. And I was thinking to myself, there are more police officers and from Cass County and Itasca County and the DNR and the State Highway Patrol than there are at the Capitol on the day when they had the insurrection. So we find it rather alarming, the massive police forces that are appearing in the north to protect a Canadian pipeline corporation. We find it deeply alarming that this corporation is also portraying us and working with law enforcement officers to portray us. At one point, I was portrayed as a possible domestic terrorist. I'm not a domestic terrorist, I'm a patriot. And as a matter of fact, I'm a water protector. And the fact that this kind of verbiage is being used and how it plays out is that water protectors are denied First Amendment rights as a consequence of this. And so sheriff's offices are calling county officials and denying water protectors and local citizens the right to hold public gatherings in public spaces. And that's a big concern to us. It is actually not correct that based on a set of assumptions, you could deny people the right to freedom of assembly. And then, there's been a lot of advising of us. And then finally, the deeper concerns we have are that Enbridge is in fact violating a number of laws and with its permit itself, and nobody is enforcing that. And so we, the citizens of Minnesota and the Anishinaabe, are faced with looking at a corporation which is presently violating terms of its contract, and there is no enforcement. And so my concerns as a northern resident are that, I like to keep hanging out here and not feel like at every turn someone's going to try to intimidate me from the police departments because Enbridge has financed them and asked them to do such. Indeed, the Department of Natural Resources has perhaps been the most aggressive. Some members of the Minnesota State Legislature came up to visit the water protector camp and to see what Enbridge was doing on public lands. Now remember, this is a public land giveaway, or Anishinaabe land giveaway if you want to look at it that way. Having said that, these are public lands given away by DNR under permits and MPCA. And so what we see is that Department of Natural Resources, which is supposed to be protecting public lands and waters, has in fact given them away and is now heavily armed and arresting water protectors in northern Minnesota. We find that to be extremely problematic, that the public forces that could be doing other things like dealing with drug busts and other things in the north are in fact attacking water protectors. Last thing I want to say is that racial profiling is quite clear. First of all, there's great attention to the number of Native people who are here as water protectors. Well, we live here. We're not going anywhere forever. We'll always be here. But we have allies coming from everywhere. And so, for instance, the Brown Berets came in from the cities. They are guards, they're guardian angels, and they're working to make sure that there's no other disruption, and they help to stay in line. Well, I heard them described by some law enforcement as the Mexican mafia. So why would we racially stereotype people to fit into some category that they should not be in? So, I'm really honored to be able to testify and to tell you that the problems in the North are increasing. We are only 2 months in. We've had this many arrests. We expect many more arrests in the coming month. And I have to ask the legislature why good Minnesota citizens should be arrested while a Canadian pipeline company proceeds ahead with a project that should have never happened.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Leduc, and it's good to meet you. I have followed your career over the years. Well, actually, career is probably a raw description, your journey over the years. And so it's good to meet you, even if it's just virtually live. I do want to say, members, that Ms. Leduc referenced a number of things. One of the things that is terribly disturbing to the chair, and I suspect to everyone here, is the horrific events that have accompanied a northern jail and the death of not one but several people of color, indigenous people. We will be diving into that issue shortly. We've had extensive conversations with the Department of Corrections regarding that. I suspect that will be a very tough hearing, but it's important that this legislature make sure that it immerses itself in the realities that are creating just horrible outcomes for our indigenous people of color, and quite frankly, for any Minnesotan, regardless. So, Ms. Leduc, we will be diving into that particular issue as well. I was stunned by the 7 times arrest figure of American Indians. I guess in a way, I'm not surprised to hear it. It's consistent with, patterns of racial inequality across sectors and across our nation. But nonetheless, it's stunning to hear. And I am reminded of a state that has a long history with our Native peoples. In fact, we live on their lands, and often that has not been, to understate it, a good relationship. And I think our challenge is to reconcile and make that a good relationship. So I'm going to stop for a second. I do have a question from Representative Frazier, and so I'll call on our Vice Chair Frazier.
Thank you, Chair. And this is just a real quick statement. I think this week has kind of it's caused me to think more, or allowed me to think more in the process about the time that I lived in Greater Minnesota. I lived in Stevens County. I lived in Blue Earth County during my time here in the state. Those were very, very impactful times, my formative years in my life. And so I always draw back on those experiences and how it shaped me and how it gives me great perspective as I sit here and I serve in this body. But I think the most important thing I want to share is that what we've heard this week from our colleagues and from our friends and our community members and neighbors in Greater Minnesota is that it's counter to some of the narrative that we often hear, that the issues that we face in our communities are limited to the metro area in our state, but particularly for our BIPOC communities and the relationships that they have with law enforcement and other agencies that are put in charge of compliance issues or serving communities in our state. So Chair, I just want to say I'm very thankful that we are providing this forum for these voices to be heard, these perspectives to be shared. And that includes our law enforcement perspective that was shared the other day. I very much so appreciated that, and I said that on the record. But I absolutely appreciate that we're allowing these communities to share their perspectives from around the state as well. And I hope all of us sitting in this committee, and any of my colleagues for either side of the aisle that are listening in and watching this or will watch this later, please, we must heed these perspectives and take them to account as we govern. because we will never get to a place where, in terms of public safety, where we all feel safe if we don't include all of these voices and our perspectives as we're governing and making laws that are set to impact all of us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative Frazier. I'm wondering, Mr. Abegas, and I do apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but it's been a while since I've been up in the Moorhead, Fargo area. I used to go up there actually quite often when I worked for the Minnesota Council of Churches, but that's well over 30 years ago. And in my early years here in the legislature, I'd go up and visit my good friend across the aisle, Representing Kevin Goodnow. And not that we always agreed, but always made sure to stop in on his shop there in Moorhead. But I'm wondering just very quickly if you can just perhaps paint a little bit of a picture as someone who resided there about the nature of the racial diversity of those communities, and particularly if you have knowledge, what the interactions and involvement of those communities have been in regard, from your perspective anyway, in regards to public safety efforts.
Yes, and thank you very much for the question. If you haven't been up into Moorhead lately, you should come on up. It's changed quite a bit from what I've heard. So I would say that the racial diversity in the Moorhead area is largely understated. And I hope a better picture of that will be reflected in the new census numbers. However, there is a large community of not just Black people, but of course there's a large community of Indigenous people here, as well as people from, I've met people here from Central and South America. I've met people here from other parts of Europe. I'm an MSUM student. There is a very large African population here that is people who have immigrated or refugees from both East and West Africa. They make up, a large part of the student population, as well as the community in which I live. Now, when it comes to police interactions, there's a large amount of distrust. I live in an area of Moorhead, which is colloquially known as being a rough part of town. I'm originally from San Diego, California. I can tell you from rough parts of town, this isn't it. However, the number of police interactions that I see is far and above what seems reasonable, rational, necessary. 3 to 4 times a week, there's a stop on my street. And if there's not a stop on my street, there's a stop on the street right next over to me. I see the police every day, 2 and 3 times a day. Every time I go outside of my house, they're here. Now, this can't be the only part of town that has crime in it. It simply doesn't follow. So in my advocacy, in my work, I know for a fact that while people try and maintain a cordial relationship with the police, and there are officers in Moorhead PD who try very hard to maintain cordial relations with members of the public. There are others who sometimes we're just not sure, and it breeds mistrust for the entire department and the entire agency. And because we are a cross-border town and are so tied with Fargo and West Fargo and in our whole metro area, a lot of what they do, unfortunately, blows back on the Moorhead police, especially when they're seen to interact with Fargo PD. I hope that answers your question. If not, I can elaborate.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to be able to paint a little fuller picture, particularly for those who have not traveled to Moorhead, and are unfamiliar with it. I still have good friends up there, so I will take you up on your offer to go visit um, Moorhead and Fargo, hopefully soon. With that, we do have several questions. Representative Grassel, Johnson, Feist, and Vague. And we'll start with Representative Grassel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, I kind of take some offense to being referred to as the Deep North. Being a former law enforcement officer and working in a multi-jurisdictional task force, fighting against violent crime, human trafficking, narcotics trafficking, all of it, and working with our tribal governments and our tribal police forces. You know, we're all Minnesotans, and we all strive to do what is best to try to help our neighbors, to protect them. For someone to make any kind of inference that our law enforcement are paid for by a corporation, not true, not true. And I'm sorry this is being allowed to be brought up in this committee. Now, the Line 3 project is an important project to maintain the integrity and the protect the environment. There have been pipelines running under the Mississippi for probably over 60 years now. And we have some of the most pristine waters in the nation. The Enbridge Corporation has worked alongside the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, the Red Lake Band, even the White Earth, and with the Fond du Lac Band. They have worked alongside with our Native American tribal governments to make sure that the route that was followed was acceptable. And I'll just give you a little example that the Line 3 replacement project included the first of its kind tribal cultural resource survey led by Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, who managed and reviewed a more than 300-mile route through the 1855, 1837, 1863, and 1864 treaty areas. Fond du Lac employed tribal cultural experts who walked the full route, identifying and recording significant cultural resources to be avoided. And there are approximately 25 tribal monitors currently monitoring construction activities. So for people to say, and this pipeline has been studied for 6 years. It has jumped, the company has jumped through all the hoops. And the people that are being referred to as the Deep North are my friends and neighbors. And they're tribal members as well. And those are also my friends and neighbors. So for someone to make any kind of slanderous remarks about my friends and neighbors, my constituents, people that, you know, a lot of people who are Native American are working on this pipeline, who I grew up with, who are benefiting greatly from jobs. And there are more than, there's Enbridge and the union, they work together to provide education and job training to the Native American people. 798 welder helper training. These are good paying jobs. Welder helper training, welder helpers. Liuna pipeline technology training. Teamsters truck driver training at Black Bear and the old casino in Leech Lake and on Red Lake over the past 3 years to try to help people to prepare for that so that they could have an opportunity to benefit from the jobs that this Line 3 replacement will bring. Now the line is over 50 years old and needs to be replaced with a more, a stronger, a better line to make sure that oil flows safely across this country, across this state. And I just, you know, I take great exception when people keep saying these things about the people of this state, the employees who are working on this line, the law enforcement that I worked with, some of my friends that I worked with over the years, to be saying that they do not treat people fairly, I take that as an insult to myself, because you and I have had lengthy discussions, Mr. Chair. And I have worked hard to make sure that anything that I put forward is going to benefit all of our citizens. And these past few days, Mr. Chair, I am saddened. I am saddened by the divisiveness that you're having come into the committee. It saddens me, because we're supposed to work together. You guys want unity. So do I, and so does every member of this committee. And I have to say that, you know, I can put all the facts in front of everybody as far as how this project, how the Native American people have been included in a lot of the decision making, making sure that it is a route that is respecting them. But that's not going to be enough. I will keep telling the truth about this project, but I'll keep getting called a liar.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask for
I'll keep telling the truth.
personal privilege, please.
Please don't interrupt me.
Hold on, members. Hold on. Representative Cleaver, and I'll certainly put you on the list. Representative Grasso, I heard your point. There are several others that wish to speak. You and I have had some good conversations. Let me just say that it is very much the intention of this chair to make sure that the various truths that are out there are shared with one another. And that's going to be a tough conversation. I totally get that. I don't think that we're going to be able to be effective at our work unless we hear those truths. And so I am hearing yours. I'm listening, absolutely. And I'm also listening to the truth that Ms. Leduc and Mr. Avagas has shared with us as well. I'll have some further comments on this toward the end of our hearing as well, but I'd like to be able to move on to our colleague, Representative Johnson, and then we'll have Representative Feist, Fang, and Representative Novotny, Cleaver, and Fraser. At some point, I'm going to put you on a list at the end because I do want to get in the other testifiers. But thank you for your comments, Representative Grasso.
Mr. Chair,
Representative Grasso.
when another member interrupts me and then I get cut off,
I totally understand.
That is not right.
Yep, I totally understand.
My apologies, Representative Grassel.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Cleaver. I think it is important that we do give each other the space, and sometimes the chair is going to give a lot of rope and space for folks to be able to say what they need to say, and sometimes the chair is going to have to move quicker. This is just an important conversation. I don't want us to talk past each other. I want us to talk with each other, even if those are uncomfortable conversations. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, just a couple things. The first is to clarify something for the first testified, Jamal Abagats. He brought up the issue with the toilet not working and an eviction issue. I can tell you those are civil issues. Law enforcement generally do not get involved in them at all. With the toilet issue, that would be the city health department that would have to deal with that, and they have to go to the city. If that's not working, the tenant or the landlord would be required to either fix it or provide a safe place for that tenant under civil law. Law enforcement does not do civil. Law enforcement, unfortunately, has to deliver the evictions notice, and if the people don't evict, the sheriff's office would have to actually physically remove 6 to 9 months down the road if they did not leave on their own. But I have another question for Ms. Winona Leduc. You're testifying about some of the things going on up there, and I'm just wondering if you're representing the tribe or you're representing yourself in these matters.
Ms. Leduc, and perhaps maybe share a little bit about. There has been some sharing from Representative Grasso about some of the agreements and arrangements and working arrangements between the tribal units and some of the individuals or interests that are involved with the Line 3.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. I mean, with all due respect, Representative Grasso, a few things. I mean, yes, this has been a highly contested pipeline, and the White Earth Band and the Red Lake Band have intervened opposing
Chair
the
Mariani,
pipeline.
could I asked the question. I'd like to have my question answered, and
Representative,
then I can move on and deal with these issues.
Representative Johnson, fair enough. I would ask all members to follow what Representative Grasso expected, that we not interrupt one another. I trust that Ms. Leduc heard your question, and so I will certainly encourage her to focus on that. I suspect she'll have additional comments relative to Mr. Grasso's or Representative Grasso's comments. Ms. Ledoux.
Yeah, I was just trying to contextualize. Thank you for just correcting. Directly to you, Representative Johnson, I represent Honor the Earth, and I'm a tribal member. And just to clarify, I work with the White Earth Tribe and the Red Lake Tribe because we've opposed the pipeline all along. And as a matter of fact, the White Earth Tribe has a cease and desist order against Enbridge from trying to undertake such activities on the White Earth Reservation. And just to be further clarifying, I mean, the fact is that the really highly participatory Cultural Resources Survey was done in a hurried manner so that it could comply with Enbridge's requests. And so I was charged with trespassing while I sat at a ceremonial lodge, which the Cultural Resources Monitor did not note. And as a matter of fact, Enbridge violated its permit by not having a Cultural Resources Monitor out ahead of them while they hit our lodge. So I'm just saying that the law is being broken by Enbridge, and I'm a water protector. And that's our position, and our tribe has opposed Enbridge as well.
Chair Mariani.
Thank you, Ms. Leduc. Representative Johnson, a follow-up, and then we'll move to Representative Feist.
May I address Representative Johnson, your clarification?
Yeah.
Mr. Abigas, you're responding to his first comment, no doubt. Yes.
First comment regarding the civil nature.
That's appropriate, please.
Yes,
please.
Thank you. That's precisely my point. You clearly stated that the matters of housing, we refer to civil matters, which for most people are inaccessible, but we'll send the cops for anything, including serving evictions. My previous point was precisely what we spend our policing dollars on and how we have the police intervene. My exhortation to you is to reevaluate how you do that. Do you hold as more important using the law, using law enforcement to protect people in their housing? Or do you want people pulled over? What are we spending our resources on? And how can we change that? That's why I presented that as such. Thank you.
Thank you for your clarification, Mr. Abigas. Representative Johnson, follow up, and then we'll move to Representative Feist.
Yeah, sure. First of all, with Mr. See if I can pronounce it correctly, Abigas. I agree. Law enforcement I served those eviction papers. I hated doing it. I served a lot of civil papers, but that is the requirement of the courts. The sheriff's, not the police departments. The sheriff's department is responsible for that. That's the only civil issues we generally try to get in. Law enforcement does not carry out civil law. That is civil. They generally do criminal law. There's a few things that we have to do in the civil courts. Restraining orders. Restraining order violation is a civil activity. Although there's a penalty, it's a civil issue, but there's a criminal penalty. We enforce those because of that criminal penalty aspect of it. Law enforcement wants to be as proactive as possible, but we're generally a reactive force. When a crime happens, we react. To get in a proactive aspect, that is where we go into the communities and work on low-level crime, because working working on the low level crime, stopping the low level stops the high level crime. But people got mad because we were doing that. And so now we're back to reactive. And the people are getting mad because there's high crime. We want to find that balance where it's right, so we keep the high crime out, but help the communities. You have a choice, either be reactive or proactive. If you're proactive, there's going to be a lot, until things change, there's going to be a lot of people charged with the low level crimes to stop the high level crimes, like the homicides, the carjackings and that stuff, which is going on like gangbusters in the metro. Now, as the final comment on Ms. Leduc, she answered my question. She is not representing the tribes. She's representing herself and the environmentalists. The tribes worked with the company. They were involved in putting it. The company has hired many tribesmen, trained them to be highly skilled welders, trained them in many highly skilled jobs, giving them the jobs that they desperately need. Because with the jobs, we're hopefully we can root out the drugs and everything else that are up there. But if you don't have a job and you're sitting around, I've worked the reservations as an undercover officer. I've seen what happens up there. By building the economy and opening up the economy, we can help root out those things and get them out of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. I do find truths in your statement. I would note that, and frankly, thank you for the frame of trying to find what that balance is. I think that is the work before us. In order to do that, we do have to confront one another's truths as well. I would note that today's testimony, I didn't seek formal tribal representation. I sought members of communities, and Ms. Leduc is clearly a member of the, she's a Bear Clan member, I believe, of the White Earth tribe in the Anishinaabe Nation. I'm calling on Representative Feist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to make one larger comment about the conversation we're having today. And that is, I don't think that unity is the goal. I think it's an exchange of ideas. I think that all of us on this committee have a really diverse set of perspectives and opinions. And I think that's great. And I think the purpose of these committee hearings is to hear one another and exchange those ideas. And I don't think the goal is realistically unity. We won't get there. And I just, as a lawyer, I don't think that when you disagree that it has to be a personal attack. I want to hear when people disagree with me, and I will never take it personally, and I will never mean it personally. And so I just think that that's an important lens that we should have coming into these, really important conversations. And the question I have kind of builds on the question that Representative Johnson asked and the answer that Mr. Abegaz gave. I'm curious, Mr. Abegaz, about where you see the balance, where you see the optimal balance in law enforcement, enforcing low-level criminal offenses versus, looking at larger societal enforcement of housing and human rights laws. And I would just be really curious, kind of what is your vision for what is the optimal law enforcement role in Minnesota? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Feist. Mr. Abegaz.
Thank you, Representative, for the question. And I think I can answer sort of both yours and Representative Johnson's, the thrust of your questions. First off, as a senior in the paralegal program at Minnesota State University Moorhead, which is an ABA accredited paralegal program, I know good and well the difference between criminal law and civil law. It is your job as representatives to strike this balance. I'm not asking for a difference between proactive and reactive policing. I'm asking you to spend state funds to meet the material needs of Minnesotans, such that law enforcement is not relied on both as the first responder for disputes, issues with mental health, issues with housing, where law enforcement does not feel the need to be profiling people. There is major work to be done within the law enforcement community. As we know, as has been documented through history, policing in the United States has its roots born out of racism and imperialism, full stop. So amongst law enforcement, what you all should do as a committee is remind them that they have a huge history to live down. As policymakers, you should be shifting resources to the programs that we know will keep people from having interactions with law enforcement. Ideally, because again, I have a broad imagination. Ideally, I would like there to not be police. I would like our needs to be met. I would like there to be maybe a very small group of people who are tasked with carrying out state violence. And those people be under a civilian leadership. That's what I would ideally like, right? We're not talking about tomorrow, we're talking about ideally. But what you all can do today, tomorrow, is to ensure that the training that law enforcement receives, both as people who are going to be law enforcement and people who go through your K through 12 and your higher education systems, know the history of their profession, why it is they've functioned like that, what they need to do in order to not function like that, how they need to confront their biases, how they need to treat people as full people and not problems. And as lawmakers, you need to shift resources. You need to spend the money on that ounce of prevention as opposed to that pound of cure, which is body armor, tanks, a police state, which is a large prison system, right? I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. Abagas. I appreciate you sharing your truth with us today. And again, there'll be many truths here, and we should not, to Representative Feist's observation, we should not shy away from sharing those with one another. Representative Vang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't really have a question. I just want to make a statement for my colleagues to really listen to the testimonies today. It's really important that we remind ourselves that we are in a position of power to create systems and policies and laws to serve all of Minnesotans. And the reality is, sometimes there are outliers to our policy that doesn't quite fit or serve all of our constituencies. And so it is our job to open that process, to facilitate that process, to hear that those who are most affected or most hurt by the policies that we create, that they come to the table and tell us what we need to do better. That is how we hold ourselves accountable, especially in public safety. There seems to be this concept about this greater Minnesota and metro divide. But as a person of color, I carry my identity everywhere I go. And we get the same type of treatment everywhere that we go. We have a history of marginalization, a history of being treated like second-class citizens. And so I really hope that my colleagues will listen to these stories of experiences that are not often felt by you, but very many times felt by other people. And many times because of the skin of your color, the color of your skin. So this process that we have here is really important. And it is our job as elected leaders to listen and to acknowledge the experiences that we may not see on a day-to-day basis, but know and acknowledge that it exists in other people. And that it is our job to make sure that our systems and policies continue to improve and to continue to conserve all of our Minnesotans' constituencies. And so I just want to remind that and give that, that's a value that I trust that all of us share. And I hope that we continue to think that moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Vang, for And I do agree. I think, the work of a legislator, I'm not complaining, but the work of a legislator is challenging. And I think the challenging part is to put ourselves in that spot where my truths don't necessarily dismiss your truths. My experiences don't erase your experiences. The tough thing about our democracy is that we've got to find a way to live together and hopefully peacefully. We have Representative Otney, and then we're going to move forward with the other testimonies. So that'll give us about a half hour to hear from these testifiers, and we'll see if we can still get some questions in. At the end, I do want to make a brief comment at the very end. So I want to allow enough time for me to have those 60 seconds. Representative Otney.
Thank you, Chair Mariani, and going to have to apologize that when I originally raised my hand for, I've been feverishly taking notes and head's just kind of spinning. Going back to my original plan from our first meeting, I want to keep first things first, so I'll get that statement out. We need to connect the dots. Ms. LeDuc, you brought up earlier in your testimony that persons of Native American heritage have a much higher rate of incarceration than the rest of the general population in Minnesota. Earlier this week, I was on a memorial Zoom broadcast that was brought on to remember the victims of intimate or domestic partners that have died in the last year. And we remembered, I believe it was 28 people that have died in domestic violence. And Commissioner Melka brought up in that meeting that Indigenous persons, Indigenous females have a almost same amount of being a victim. They're much higher and much more likely to be a victim than the general population. So just keep that in mind. You've got the people that are incarcerated at a much higher rate. The victims are also at a much higher rate. They're much more likely to be involved in human trafficking. So, keep that in mind also. To Mr. Abagaz, you talk about traffic stops. Traffic stops can be a very important part of preventing crime. Just the presence of the squad and people knowing that it is a active law enforcement function. Right now, with the Minneapolis Police Department, for example, being so overwhelmed and understaffed, there's no traffic enforcement going on. If you look at the statistics right now, it's not even safe to cross the street in some areas. If the same amount of hit and run pedestrian traffic was going on in Edina, there would be outrage. And there should be outrage, but there should also be outrage at how unsafe it is in some communities in Minnesota. Let's connect the dots. And in closing, I just thought it was ironic that Mr. Abagaz talks about how we shouldn't have profiling. And then in his next sentence goes and makes a blanket statement about the motives and the basis for all of law and law enforcement. It's just heartbreaking. I want to look forward. If our entire view, if we were on a highway and we're driving, you wouldn't have a rear view mirror that blocked your entire view. All you can see is in the back. It's important to remember where we've come from, but let's not be causing more accidents and causing more problems because we're letting that rear view mirror block our path forward. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Otney. I'll have Mr. Abagaz and Ms. LeDuc respond if they wish. And then we'll, at the conclusion of that, we'll move forward to the other part of today's hearing. Mr. Abegas?
Yes, I'm just a bit baffled here. I'm sure the representative did not mean to insinuate that by studying history, we are creating our own problems with law enforcement. However, it is important to learn from history. We do not want to repeat the failures of our history. And when I say that the history of law enforcement in the United States is based on slavery and imperialism, that is a point of fact. That is a point of documented historical record. It's not really up for discussion. It's not something I like, something I have to acknowledge, and we have to move forward with that. And in order to move forward with that, we need to learn it and stare that in the face and learn its lessons and improve on ourselves and our policies in order to get to somewhere productive. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abegas. Ms. Ledoux?
Just a couple of comments. Jamal, again, thank you for what you said. And, I've been wanting to give a little history in Aiken County of law enforcement and Native people, the amount of times the sheriff burned down Indian people's houses here to drive them out, the number of Indian people who died in incarceration up here in these counties. So it's important for law enforcement to have a little history lesson as to the rights violations by law enforcement of Native people in the North. All of us were raised with that. We all know it. We all live with it. We're all, I've raised 6 boys. You think I tell them to go out? I'm like, be careful, it's the North. I mean, that's the reality of the situation we live in. And thank you, though, Representative Novotny, about, for bringing up the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and we do appreciate the police, looking at that and beginning to be concerned. The circumstances which create that are very significant. And a lot of those actually have to do with these transient workers that come into northern Minnesota. And that's where most of our concerns come from. I mean, most of the violence against Native women is not by Native people, it's by non-Native people. That's our experience, and that's the case of missing and murdered women. So I am hoping that law enforcement will take far more interest in that. And also, an ounce of precaution is a lot more than a pound of cure. If you keep those 4,200 transient workers out of northern Minnesota, that would probably help our case a little bit too. And I just want to say, with all due respect, it is a different landscape if you are a woman of color, an Indian woman in the North, and you're looking at a police who stops you on a county road when you're driving your car and there is nobody in sight. That's not something you necessarily want to have happen to you if you're a Native woman. I want us all to work together. I agree. We all live in the same place. And what I'm trying to figure out is why there are so many police arresting water protectors and not arresting, other criminals in the North. So important to have a history lesson. If y'all had good history lessons, we probably wouldn't be quite in the situation we're in. So we're going to work on that and work together because, I want peace too. And, so that's just, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Leduc. I am struck by, I do believe we have more common desires and common needs than we have our differences, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at our differences. Those are important for all the reasons that have been shared here today. I want to thank both of you for coming today and spending time with us, and look forward to having an ongoing conversation and work with you as well. Members, we're going to move to the next part of the
Chair Piani, I do have a question for you, if I may.
Very quickly, Representative Johnson.
I'm just wondering if the protocols have changed where testifiers get the last word instead of legislatures have the last word on issues. If you could answer.
Representative Johnson, I don't know what protocol you're talking about. This hearing is not over yet. And perhaps you and I could have an offline conversation about what your expectations are. We're talking about engaging the public and listening to citizens, and that is a proud, strong tradition of this institution, and it's what makes for good law. And so I think, quite frankly, it's our role, frankly, my personal belief, it's our role to listen more than be talking to civilians. We will have plenty of time debating with one another, particularly when we hit the floor with these bills. Members, we're going to move on to the next part of the hearing. This is to look at the programming needs in Greater Minnesota. We have Mr. Elliot Boutai, Executive Director of NAMI, Ms. Liz Richardson, and Artika Roller from Violence Free Minnesota and Minkasa, and then finally Mr. Tim Wash with Minnesota Teen Challenge. I apologize to all of you. I'm going to have to rush your testimony, so keep that in mind in terms of highlighting and bulleting your points for us today. This is not the end of the conversation. So I believe we're starting with Mr. Boutai.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, indeed, sir. Good
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I do want to clarify, I am not the executive director of NAMI.
That's right. I know that.
Yes.
And Susan will really take after me.
She is a double booked today, but I'm the criminal justice coordinator at NAMI Minnesota, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I coordinate our policy and advocacy efforts to decriminalize mental illnesses in Minnesota. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to share today. As most of you know, without a fully built mental health system and affordable supportive housing, people with mental illnesses often end up in the justice system. And people with mental illnesses struggle to access care across the state, but particularly in Greater Minnesota, there are different and significant barriers like long distances to travel, workforce shortages, and then there are cultural and attitudinal barriers as well. We know that law enforcement officers respond to mental health crisis in Greater Minnesota the same that they do in the metro area, the same proportionately, but they often respond without the same level of support and with fewer options to respond to those crises. And while every county in Minnesota has a mobile crisis team, in rural Minnesota, they often are regional and they'll cover long distances over multiple counties. So even when there are partnerships between police and crisis teams, which there are many in Greater Minnesota, it can take a crisis team over an hour to respond and provide support to law enforcement in some situations. So we leave officers with the choice to wait for the crisis team to take a person to jail or to take them to the hospital. And there are also fewer hospitals to take people to in Greater Minnesota. And we know we work with police departments across the state, and we know that they have the desire and the need for more training, like crisis intervention team training. But in a department with 10 or 20 officers, the costs and logistics of sending an officer to a 40-hour training make it nearly impossible. And the smaller departments will have difficulty, collaborating with mental health professionals because of their staffing levels. And we also know just the shortage of mental health. Building the mental health system in Minnesota is what we need across the state equitably. We hear often that people are being taken to Fargo to find a psychiatric bed, and the time and cost it takes to transport a person with a serious mental illness across the state is borne by rural counties and law enforcement agencies. There are some counties that use something called protected transport under non-emergency medical transport, and it's billable with Medicaid, and we wish that more would expand that, but that's also a resource issue. Our rural community mental health providers deliver these essential services, but they're often met with barriers through the workforce shortages, and low reimbursement rates. Particularly for psychiatry. Psychiatry is extremely hard to access all across the state, and even more so in Greater Minnesota, especially for children and youth. For people who seek psychiatry or want to see a psychiatrist, they have to wait on wait lists for 3 months or more, or they have to rely on telemedicine. And while telemedicine has allowed a lot of flexibility recently because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it doesn't work for everyone. People with poor internet connections or people that don't have access to computers or tablets, these innovations aren't going to work equitably for them. And the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has had a lot of impacts on mental health providers and people with mental illnesses. At the beginning of the pandemic, mobile crisis teams weren't given PPE immediately in the ways that a lot of other first responders were. And even now, many of the teams have had to lay off staff, and there are many teams that haven't gone out in person since March of 2020. So it started with that initial kind of barrier, and it's just persisted with the difficulties of finding staff and maintaining a sustainable service. But with all those barriers, there are lots of innovations that still our rural providers are doing a great job. There's community certified behavioral health clinics, and they have a different reimbursement formula, and they're designed to create kind of a one-stop shop for mental health and substance use disorders and treatment. And they've been very successful, and there are 5 in greater Minnesota. There's other innovations that have put social workers in county jails to help with discharge planning, particularly in places like Aiken and Cass and Crow Wing, Morrison. And we know that people are working to expand telehealth and providing community mental health treatment in jails, which is important so that when people leave the jail, they're plugged into services and treatment instead of being put out with maybe 3 days of medication. And then the situation is they need to wait 3 months to find a provider that can get them back on that medication. And all of a sudden they're back in jail a couple nights later. So there are a lot of barriers, and there's just a lot of needs that the state funds, a lot of these services, like mobile crisis teams, and we need more resources, frankly. Also, just wanted to point out, and I'll be done quickly, that earlier this week in the Preventing Homelessness Committee, the Department of Corrections shared data showing that last year, over 3,000 people were released from Minnesota prisons into homelessness. And that of those people that were released, 50% came from 4 counties: Washington, Scott, Polk, and Clay. So we know that issues like homelessness are not metro issues. There are high suicide rates, disproportionately high among farmers, and that's a serious and unique concern for families in greater Minnesota. And the need, as we've heard about today, for culturally specific treatments and providers is urgent, and it's as imperative as it's as serious as our imperative to address systemic racism. The disparities in rural Minnesota, particularly against Native and Indigenous communities, are serious. The lack of resources against Native American healers and healing practices and other culturally specific treatments, they directly add to the disparities in the criminal justice system. So we know when we talk about public safety, we often think about criminal justice systems, but at NAMI, we know that true and complete community public safety, community-centered public safety, that means housing the homeless and removing the barriers that people have to accessing treatment. And it means access to mental health care and support in schools, and providing equitable access to technology and broadband internet. And so we believe, building our mental health system equitably across the state is community-centered public safety. So with that, I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Boutai. And it is Boutai, right? I think I said Bowtie earlier, but it's Boutai.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us. So much here. I've learned a few things, and the challenges are perhaps not distinct, but they sure feel pretty pronounced with parts of greater Minnesota in terms of infrastructure and resource shortfalls. So with that, members, we can move on to Ms. Liz Richardson and Artika Roller. Ms. Richardson is with Violence Free. I hope I get this right, the order. And Ms. Roller is with Bincasa. Correct me if I'm wrong, but please, welcome.
That is fine. And do I have the ability to do a screen share? We put together a quick PowerPoint.
Yes, you do. Yes.
Okay, I will. Is that showing up on people's screens?
It is.
Okay, great.
Super.
Let's see if we can get it to roll. Okay, so Chair Mariani, members of the committee, I am Liz Richards, the Executive Director of Violence Free Minnesota. I'm here today with Artika Roller, who is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Mincasa. We were asked to provide information on the needs and programming of domestic and sexual violence victims specific to greater Minnesota.
Ms. Richards, we have 15 minutes left
Right.
in
Yep.
hearing. So just keep that in mind, but please.
Yep. You will try and be as brief and informative as we can be.
Yeah, we still need to hear from Teen Challenge. So
Right. So we're both statewide coalitions. And we thought we'd tell you, these are Violence-Free Minnesota member programs. We have 90 programs. The ones highlighted are our programs in Greater Minnesota. Now, I know you can't really see that very well, so here's a quick breakdown. We have 26 emergency shelters, 15 in Greater Minnesota. Of our 64 non-shelter programs, 35 are in Greater Minnesota. For MinCasa, they have 66 member programs. We have some overlap in membership, but 62% of their members are in Greater Minnesota. That's 41 programs. And now I think Artika is going to pick it up, talking about specific needs.
Sure. Good
welcome,
morning,
Ms.
Chair
Roller.
Mariani and members of the committee. As Liz highlighted, the majority of MinCasa's programs are in Greater Minnesota. Many of these programs are sexual assault centers that offer critical emergency responses to victims of sexual assault. The unique challenges for victims and survivors of Greater Minnesota have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Unfortunately, many of our programs are still experiencing the same barriers that they faced a year ago at the beginning of the pandemic. Isolation has increased. It has pushed victims and survivors further away from safety, justice, and healing. Access to wellness resources have decreased, and the stressors that led to sexual assault have increased, including the uptick in racial injustices and the economic downturn. This is a critical period for ensuring that Greater Minnesota residents can rely on basic safety nets. Here are a few things our frontline workers of sexual assault advocacy and prevention in Greater Minnesota have shared with us this week. There's 5 critical areas: overwhelmed advocates, distance and providing services, lack of legal representation, direct assistance to victims and survivors, and technology. The increase for technology resources, I spoke with Yvette Ellis from Support Within Reach, a program that has 6 locations in Greater Minnesota this week. She states one of her biggest concerns is her internet bandwidth, the loss of connection during critical meetings with her professional colleagues and her participants continues to be a stressor for their program. In addition, same nurses are further away from emergencies than folks in metro areas. They might be providing emergency resources for 9 different counties within their reach. Again, a lack of representation of legal representation for survivors is a critical issue for Greater Minnesota programs. Funding for critical sexual assault responses services currently come from our criminal justice, OJP, Health and Human Services state-funded resources, which are restricted in prescribed funding for specific outcomes for these programs. Many of our programs do not have enough administrative capacity to launch new funding efforts to make up for the loss of funding resources and dollars that they have experienced during COVID around their fundraising. Marion Washburn from our Brainerd Sexual Assault Services stated that it is a continuous struggle for nonprofit agencies in rural communities around lack of resources for seeking new funding. She states that they struggle with these limited resources and their grants are often restricted funding. Lack of reserved funds can be detrimental to our rural programs. Sometimes there's waiting periods between grant awards. It could be up to 3 months. If a grant ended in December and their new contract is not executed until March 1st, if they do not have unrestricted funds or general operations, they can't back bill for that period of time when their contract was not executed. So that tends to be a stressor. She states that it was extremely stressful in 2020 due to the restrictions of COVID and the inability for her to participate in her active fundraising efforts. MinCasa firmly believes that strong funding basis for our member programs will allow programs to connect more people to effective safety, justice, and healing resources that will lead to a healthier and safer greater Minnesota. Liz, can you advance to the next slide?
And we're about 5 minutes left here, so I just.
Oh, okay, all right. I guess we are going to go to the next slide real quickly. I would say overall, due to our funding challenges in greater Minnesota, our rural communities have found ways to stretch their dollars, expand their reach through collaboration. And although collaboration is a great way for our programs to build relationships in community, it is not a reliable and a sustainable method model for our programs to continue to do the work that they're doing. I am going to say, in conclusion, our coalitions and our networks foster meaningful collaborations and relationships, and I will turn it over to Liz to do the final summary.
Right. And so we were also asked, what are the state resources that go into our work? And so most of our programs are receiving funding through the Office of Justice Programming, which is under the Department of Public Safety. The funding amounts that our individual programs receive through OJP ranges anywhere from 50% of their budgets to over 90% of their budgets. So primary funder for us. The state distributes 4 pots of money, 3 federal and 1 in the state. And those are listed there. The Federal Department of Health and Human Services has about 1.8 million coming into the state each year for this work. The Department of Justice has 2 pots of money. The Victims of Crime Act VOCA money comes in at 32 million, our largest source of funding. And the Violence Against Women Act funding at 1.3 million. The state general fund is about approximately 24 million that goes into this work. And I would say that our Department of Justice VOCA money is our most volatile money, going up and down, and it's currently in jeopardy. So that's a huge concern to us as we look at a potential loss of that largest source of revenue or a significant reduction of it. So we did a quick breakdown. This is the money that the Office of Justice Programming puts out specific to domestic and sexual violence programs. If you total those amounts on the previous page very quickly, there's about an additional 10 million, but those go to other crime victim sorts like general crime victims, abused children. The money going to domestic and sexual assault programs in the state is approximately 49 million, 48% of that in the 7-county metro region, and the rest is divided up between 5 and 12% of that funding to each of those regions in the state. So that's just a very quick overview of the OJP funding state resources. What we're looking at as coalitions, as you look at the budget this coming year, is we're asking for funding increases in 4 critical areas. One is to increase the funding for victim and offender services. So additional money for victim services across the state, and that asking also for money that would go into offender services. Currently, that is not an area that is funded at all by the state. Next, we're asking for direct victim support for things like, emergency transportation needs, emergency security needs like changing of locks. The third area is prevention. The legislature 2 years ago did money for some prevention grants through the Department of Health. And so really looking to continue that programming and strengthen that. So looking to support additional prevention grant funding. And the last area is an ask that is coming from the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless for their emergency services program, ESP funding, which is a housing source of funding. So we're also supporting that ask as well. So those are the areas where we think we would love to see an increase in support for this work in the budget.
Very well,
And so
thank you. Thank you, Ms. Richards and Ms. Roller. And we will, when we're at budget construction time, we'll no doubt revisit some of these as well. So thank you for sharing that. I'm really struck by the intersection of so many of these issues, just thinking about distance, legal, and technology, for instance, and how they impede on one another just in those 3 areas. Particularly instructive, and particularly that distance issue for me in terms of a distinctive feature, relative to I mean, I'm a person who can walk my whole district in one day. And that's certainly not the case in most parts of Minnesota. We're going to move very quickly on to Mr. Walsh with Minnesota Teen Challenge. Our crack staff has bought us a few more minutes, probably a little 5 minutes, so we're going to extend out beyond noon. And I will try to get some questions in. I did forewarn everyone I wanted to 45, 60 seconds at the very end to make some closing comments as chair as we prepare for next week. But at this point, Mr. Walsh, please come forward.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Tim Walsh. I'm the Vice President of Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge. I'm also a member of March. And rather than echo Menkasa, Nami, and the earlier presenters, we have a report that we can send to you that details all of the needs within rural Minnesota for people with substance use disorders and co-occurring disorders. And in fact, it does parallel mirror virtually everything that you have heard. Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge serves Greater Minnesota. We serve about 3,300 people per year in our 12 campuses and our continuum of services in the various regions. Some of the things that I would simply like to highlight, you've seen the data. There was a 31% increase in overdoses in the year period up to June of 2020, and the Department of Health, CDC, and everyone else who's monitoring this says it's going to get worse. And that, of course, is the deepest end of the need. That reflects actually what we call the deaths of despair. And so what we're going to see from 2020 is an increase in suicides, homicides, accidental deaths. You're going to see spikes in drug and alcohol use across the state of Minnesota, hospitalizations. That is what's coming in our front door. The unfortunate part of this COVID, in fact, it's tragic, is that people have been more afraid of the pandemic than they are of the life course of their substance use disorder and mental health disorders. So if you can help us to get the word out, they're going to get much better care and treatment than they are actually even in the community, folks. And we get about 50,000 calls for help per year. That's 50,000. And so that is what people are saying to us. Another thing that we're hoping, in a sense, gets back to normal is people have all kinds of motivations for getting into treatment, and probation, parole actually can play a part in motivating people to get the treatment that they need. So we actually believe that there's a positive role to be played there for probation and parole that is very difficult for them to play right now during the pandemic. Then also in the rural areas, you'll see that between 10 and 20% in every category of use is greater in Greater Minnesota on a per capita basis. And so whatever stats you see for the metro area, add another 10% or 20% in terms of drug and alcohol use. And then, of course, you have people struggling with joblessness and homelessness and finances in those communities, and that's just going to lead to more mental health issues and also substance use disorder issues. At Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, we work with many justice-involved people and people who are formerly incarcerated. I do need to say on the behalf of my profession, we've gotten a 1.5% increase in our rates in 10 years. Not a single industry could exist on a 1.5%. And the only reason that Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge can survive in this environment is we have incredibly generous donors. That's how we survive. We do not actually make our margins as it relates to government funding, although that helps. I want to just echo the need for telehealth services and making those permanent for LADCs to be providing those services. And if Mr. Chair, if I can just be allowed perhaps another minute or two to talk about a wish list, is that okay?
Very quickly, sir, please.
Very quickly. So and folks, we've worked with this committee and Health and Human Services Committee, and you've done amazing work. Probation, restructuring, conditional release, diversion, community alternatives to incarceration. We've been a good partner with this committee and others to advance those. What we hope can now happen is when you get proposals for prison and probation reform, to remember that it's the reforms that have been passed already through these committees and in Health and Human Services that can be applied to both people coming out of prison and jail and people that are on probation. And if you apply those, we're ready to go in to do assessments, to do transportation, to then get them to the treatment services they need, to provide behavioral health, to provide peer support, to provide treatment coordination and a whole continuum of care. We have open beds right now. We have housing that's available right now. It is not being utilized. I don't know if that's shocking to you. It's shocking to me that we have those resources, we have the programs, we have the funding, we're ready as a community, we're willing to do that. So when you hear prison reform, think us. When you hear probation reform, think us. We can fill that gap that they're going to talk to you about. We can fill that gap. That doesn't have to be filled by prison staff, and it doesn't actually have to be filled by probation staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. The work of Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge so badly needed, always, but especially in this moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
In a conversation with you. Members, we've got 4 minutes. We've got 3 or 4 folks. The chair is going to exercise prerogative to make closing comments. So at some point, I may not get to all four of you, but I will certainly call on those who have not had a chance to speak yet. Representative Cleaborn. Representative Cleaborn.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I didn't hear my name. First, I would like to apologize to the committee for interrupting today. What I would like to say is I would like our committee to please be one that empowers our testifiers, no matter who they are, from all across our state. I want us to be able to truly listen and hear what the testifiers are saying. We can have conversations amongst ourselves. We could private caucus later. We can do lots of things to talk about where we agree and disagree. I would also like to thank Representative Feist. I think she's exactly right. This is a space where we take ideas from the public and then we have that exchange of conversation amongst ourselves as legislators and we craft good policy. I also agree with Representative Feist that the opportunity of growth comes where we disagree, not where we are all in lockstep with each other. And that all begins with being able to really hear from Minnesotans all across our state. So that's all I want to say. Please, could we just listen to the testifiers without engaging in argument with them? It helps not only the representative who may disagree with what's being said, but it helps those of us who may be distracted by the argument. So please allow us to listen to the testifiers in whole without arguing with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Cleaborn. Your years of experience as a facilitator, mediator shines through here. Thank you for the good advice. Representative Hollins.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. My question is specifically for Ms. Richards and Ms. Roller. I believe they're still on. I really wanted to talk about the fact that we heard earlier that Indigenous women are disproportionately involved in the criminal justice system. And we also know that it's likely that most, if not all of them, have a history of victimization and trauma. So what are we doing to provide culturally specific programming for these women so that they can be diverted from our corrections system?
Great question, and unfortunately a 30-second response, which won't do any justice, but Ms. Roller and or Ms. Richards.
Chair Mariani, Representative Hollins, thank you for your question. We have a sister coalition, the Minnesota Coalition, Minnesota Indian Women's Coalition, and they are actually doing a lot of work to reach out to Indigenous women that have experienced sexual violence. They have member programs they also support, and we work in collaboration with them and tribal liaisons as well. Liz?
And Representative, we'll give you some information offline about some specific project work that we're doing right now, jointly among the coalitions, specifically working on issues with justice-involved Native women.
Thank you, Bob.
Fabulous, thank you.
And thank you, Representative Hollins. Great question, which we're going to be hearing legislation, no doubt, soon from the MMIW group related to this issue. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Walsh, who I have worked with in the past many times on great legislation, and I was actually a director at Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge. My question is, because Teen Challenge is all across this great nation of ours, are you seeing a different story in other states? I know that Minnesota is very restrictive. I just did an entire study on how restrictive Minnesota is and in their COVID measures. And I'm just wondering, are you seeing the same kind of despair in other states as well? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd forgotten your history with Adult Teen Challenge, Representative O'Neill. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative O'Neill. Yes, we are. We're seeing exactly these trends across the entire United States. All of the statistics of despair, the restrictions that are leading to people not getting the treatment that they need, people waiting too long for treatment and care, and as a result, we're seeing these kinds of outcomes with folks, and that's, yeah, I just wanted to sound the alarm, and so thank you for allowing me to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. And then finally, Representative Johnson, and then I'll make a brief closing comments. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, members, first of all, I want to thank Teen Challenge. That's one of the programs that actually works very, very well. They have taken an attitude to help anybody and anyone, but they do it in a way that it actually works. The dollars we spend there is minor compared to what we spend on other programs. And they have, last I heard, is 80+% success rate. Where the other programs we're spending millions of dollars more, they're happy to, well, we don't really know their success rate because they always talk about return on the dollar. I like success rate, and they have a great one, and I want to keep continuing using them. We need to work hard on the domestic abuse issues and stuff like that. I was surprised that the program in my county that works very well was not on their list. And with the mental health issues, I checked my former department's personnel policy, and they are working with the mental health units. It's in their policy. They're working with, they're collaborating with them, working with them. But unfortunately, in greater Minnesota, and even in the metro, law enforcement is always going to be the one to respond first to a mental health issue because they need to make it sure it's safe for the mental health workers to go in. So, but I want to thank all the testifiers on this portion of it. They did a fantastic job. We need to work together to end domestic violence and sexual assault. Unfortunately, we're the human race and we have some bad actors, and we got to figure out a way to keep the bad actors away from the good people, and so we don't have so many victims.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. We are blessed in this state with incredible, smart, and focused people who want to do right. And our job is to make sure that we create the laws that make it possible for them to do that and appropriate the resources to do that. Members, sometimes we hear in this committee, sometimes the things that we hear in this committee are tough to hear. I have chaired over some very heart-wrenching, challenging hearings. So whether it's from survivors of assault, from prosecutors, or from community members, or civil rights advocates, some who have lost their confidence in our public safety system, some specifically in our law enforcement, others who have faith in it and who have faith in our law enforcement, all of them struggle with resources. I believe our lawmaking role is not to deny the lived reality of Minnesotans, but to make sure that our public institutions are in fact responsive in hearing them. Preventing lawless harm should be our common goal, whether we like the Minneapolis Police Department or not, for instance, or whether we like Line 3 or not, or whether we like urban centers or not, or rural communities or not. Our job is to prevent lawless harm. We can't meet our duty as lawmakers and be against harm only when it is politically convenient to our particular beliefs. Harm is harm, whether a police officer or a system of police causes it, or a police officer is harmed, or the behavior of those that we ideologically agree that causes it. Our strength, I believe, as a civilized people lays here, where we hear each other as we write the laws to govern ourselves for peace and freedom. And I believe that our strength lies in trust, and trust lies in building respectful human relationships. I think the state has obligations to aid locals when they request help in keeping their populations safe from foreseeable, preventable crime, regardless of region, regardless of race, regardless of party. Next week, we will hear a bill that will draw plenty of criticism from various corners as it seeks to make sure that mutual aid collaboration among locals can guarantee the safety and freedoms of the public when major events unfold. I look forward to that debate among ourselves. I hope that these 2 weeks of hearings will allow us the wisdom to make the right choice on that bill and other bills to come. So members, please have a good, solid, blessed, peaceful weekend. Come prepared next week for some good work. And so until Tuesday of this week, or next week rather, this committee stands adjourned.